Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us on this Sunday evening. We were expecting Matthew to be with us tonight, but I suppose the main man is here, John Cleese, who needs no introduction. A slightly different format to the event this evening, but John is very kindly going to just have a nice conversation with you all, and then we will take Q&A at the end. So if you do have any questions, please enter them in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. But I will pass over to you, John, and let me know when you're ready for questions and answers, okay?
Okay, sure. Hello, folks. Yes, we were expecting Matthew to turn up, but he's not here. So he's probably forgotten. He's getting a bit old these days. So I'll do a little bit of a chat on my own. I'm delighted to do any questions afterwards. This is the book which I shall now hold up. It's very short, and the reason it's short, you know that quote, I think it's Mark Twain who said, "I'm sorry this is such a long letter, but I didn't have time to write a shorter one." Well, I had the time to write a shorter book, because I feel very frequently these days that when I read a book, particularly American ones, the first 70 pages is very good, very interesting, and the sort of rest is a bit padding to sort of stretch it out to 300 pages. And I don't think there's any need to do that in this case, because I think creativity can be explained relatively simply, and without adding facts. You know, psychologists writing about creativity will say if you travel a lot in your youth, that will make you more creative, but that's not much use to you unless you're able to move backwards in time. So I'll tell you that when I was at school, nobody ever mentioned creativity. Word would never have occurred to us. We did 2 painting lessons a week, I suppose that was it. But when I was about 15, I remember I wrote an essay for Jumper G, my English teacher, and we were told to write an essay on time. And I wrote the whole essay about the fact that I had not had time to write the essay, which I thought was retrospectively quite clever and quite amusing. But of course, I got the response, "Oh, Cleese, this isn't a proper essay." And that, I think, sums up what you get at school. Kids of 6, you go into a classroom and say, "Any of you creative?" Well, put their hands up. 10-year-olds, probably 60% of them put their hands up. By the time you're at 12-year-olds, maybe 20%. By the time you're asking 16-year-olds, they're all looking around the class to see who this oddity is. And it's because I think creativity is simply drilled out of us, not intentionally, not unkindly, but it's just not asked for. And nobody explains that it might be quite useful sometime, for example, if you're a businessman or a writer, to know how to create the conditions in which you can become a little more creative. And I arrived I got into Cambridge on science. When I got there, I found to my horror that there were a lot of scientists at Cambridge who were really interested in science, and I felt that put them at a rather unfair advantage. So I switched to law, again, not a very creative subject, but I joined the Footlights, and that's where I began to make discoveries. First of all, I discovered that if I was given a sheet of paper, I could write something on it that made people laugh sometimes, if I was lucky. I started doing that and rather enjoying it. And the first thing I noticed was that I would sometimes, when I'd finished my academic work, I'd try and write a sketch. And as usual, I would get stuck on the punchline, because it's always the hardest thing. And I'd sit there cudgeling my brains and give up and go to bed. And I'd wake up in the morning, make myself a cup of coffee and sit down. And very frequently, I'd get the answer, how to resolve the sketch, in the first 90 seconds or 2 minutes. Like, oh, and I thought, well, what was the difficulty last night? And it puzzled me until I began to realize that my unconscious must have been working on it during the night. While I was asleep, my unconscious must have been chewing it over in some way. And I just about noticed that when I'd written a sketch with Graham Chapman. We were writing together by 1962, and I lost it, as I'm always doing, because I'm very vague, and I knew Gray would be cross with me, so I looked for it and I couldn't find it, and I wrote it out from memory. And then I found the original, and I compared the two, and the one I'd done from memory was simply better. It was neater and cleaner and briefer, you know, brevity is the soul of wit, and it was better. And I thought, but I wasn't trying to make it better, I was just trying to recall it. So this is another example that my brain must have been working on it while I was getting on with my life. So this fascinated me. And then I heard of a particular psychological experiment which fascinated me. Some psychologists had shown a selected group of people some Chinese ideograms, and then a few days later they'd come back and they said to the people, we're going to show you Chinese ideograms again. Some of them you would have seen last week, some of them not. We want you to tell us if you saw them last week. And it was hopeless. There were absolutely nobody could remember it all. So they then repeated the experiment, this time on the second week. Instead of saying, we want you to tell us which one you saw last week, they said something quite different. They said, we just want you to have a feeling about these. And if there's any ideograms that you just like, that you just look at and think, I like this one better than the last one, just tell us. And what they discovered was that the ideograms that everybody liked were the ones they'd seen the previous week, which is extraordinary, because it means that the mind actually at some level did know and did recognize what they'd seen last week, but they couldn't answer the question. They had to express this knowledge through a feeling of, oh, I rather like the look of that. And I began to see how much of our unconscious, and I'm not using it in the Freudian sense of all the nasty, envious, horrible bits that have to be put in the dustbin when we keep the lid on, but I'm using, you know perfectly well how some of you, not me, but some of you have practiced the piano. Because what you have to do is an awful lot of playing the piano has obviously got to become completely automatic, and you do that by doing drills and drills and drills, so that you don't have to think anymore consciously of where you're putting your fingers. And this is true of practicing a golf swing or almost anything like this. If you are dyeing up your shoelaces, you don't have to think how to do it. Your little hands take over and tie the shoelaces. And in fact, if you try to think what you're doing, it becomes more difficult. So we have an unconscious that is a very intelligent unconscious, and that can help us in all sorts of ways. But the only thing about the unconscious is you can't order it about and hit it with a stick. You have to figure out how to make it work. But another example of the useful unconscious, you get in the car to drive to the office in the old days, and you don't really think where you're going. You're not consciously thinking where you turn or anything. You're just doing through the routine when you're thinking about something completely different. So your intelligent unconscious is taking care of that task and freeing your mind up for other things. And that's why you do practice the golf swing, so that you're not thinking, I must keep my left wrist down or something like that. You're able to forget all that and start thinking about how damp the green is and whether the wind's going to blow the ball very far either way. So you're freeing up. If you're an actor, you learn the lines so much and so hard and practice them so you can forget them completely, and then you can put all your mental energy into acting and not have 20% of your mind occupied thinking, what the so-and-so do I say next? So once you got the idea of the intelligent unconscious, once I got that, I then met a lovely guy from Sussex University. He was a sort of professor there, Brian Bates, and he told me about some research that had been done at Berkeley in the 70s. He said there'd been some very useful research on creativity, but it kind of hit the wall. And the reason is there's only so much you can say about the unconscious. After a time, it's kind of, well, that's it, folks. So he told me about a guy called McKinnon, who was a remarkable man. He'd been a spy master during the war, telling the US military what sort of people could be parachuted behind enemy lines. But he was fascinated by creativity, not so much creative artists, all those people, you know, the painters and the musicians and all of those. He was interested in a lot of the professions, businessmen and engineers, and particularly architects, because he said they had got to be very artistic and also got to be very competent, because there's no point in building a beautiful bridge if it falls down. So he was very interested in them, and he went to all the architects whom other architects said, well, they're particularly creative. And he said, what do you do from the moment you get up in the morning to the moment you go to bed at night? And then he went around a lot of non-creative artists, so he didn't tell them that was why he was talking to them. And he said, what do you do in the morning from the moment you get up in the morning to the moment you go to bed at night? And what he discovered was there were two differences. And one is surprising, but I don't want to talk about it too much because it distracts people. The main thing was he found that the creative architects were no more intelligent than the uncreative ones. But there was one huge difference, and that was they knew how to play. They knew how to sit back and be really interested in what the problem was, as opposed to forcing themselves to resolve, to solve it so that it could be resolved, they could move on. They get really interested in the problem. Richard Feynman is a perfect example of this kind of mind. And what he discovered was that if they got really interested in the problem, they would become much more playful. He actually called the playfulness childlike playfulness. And if they could do that, then they became much more creative. And there was a lot of research that, this was the research, I'm sorry, that just simply said the creative ones, the only difference is that they play more. So I began to think, well, yes, I can understand it, because after all, the main thing about children of 6, for example, is that they know how to play. You don't have to teach them. And I thought this is absolutely fascinating. And then I thought, well, why can children play and adults not? And I thought, well, children can play because the parents are minding the shop. Or some adult is, they're making sure that everything's all right and dinner's going to be on the table at the right time. Children don't have to worry about that. And I then read a book by a fellow called, oh God, he was a Dutch historian who wrote the Waning of the Middle Ages. Huizinga, I think his name was, and it was called Homo Ludens, playing man. And what he said was, and I'd never seen this before, that play has to be separate from ordinary life. If you think of a football match, when the referee blows the whistle, a whole new way of playing takes place. It's almost as though the laws of England are temporarily forgotten. Everything, and nobody's allowed to come on the pitch except the players, and they play for a certain amount of time, and then the referee blows the whistle and we go back to ordinary life. But during that time, between the two blasts on the whistle, what you have is a situation where people just play. And the more I thought about this, the more I thought that this is interesting, because I'd already noticed how disastrous interruptions are to the creative process. I would sit there sort of building up a scene from 40 Towers and thinking, Sybil's in this mood, Basil's in this mood. The major comes in from the room, one of the guests is there, and somebody, the phone would ring. And I'd pick the phone up and deal with it and put it down again. Then I had to reassemble all these elements in my mind. And recently I was talking to Judd Apatow, who's made a lot of comedy films. And he said there was research saying that if you take an interruption, it takes you somewhere like 15 to 20 minutes for your mind to get back where it was when you were interrupted. So interruptions are deadly to the creative process. So thinking of Huizinga and play being separate from ordinary everyday life, I realized that the key to all of this was to be able to play in a childlike way. And the playing in a childlike way could only be achieved in the following circumstances. You have to make boundaries of space. You have to put yourself in a space where you're not going to be interrupted. And then you have to do that for a specific period of time. You give yourself, I would say, an hour and a quarter or maybe an hour and a half. And when you do that, you sit down. If you're at the top of the hierarchy, you say to your PA, don't interrupt me unless the building catches fire. And if you're at the bottom of it, then you go and sit in the park or somewhere where no one's going to interrupt you. And then you sit there quietly and you just start to try to play. And for the first 15 minutes, it's completely impossible because you can only think of the things you ought to be doing. I should have called Ted. Oh, God, I forgot to buy the birthday present, and I've got to get a present for the hamster. And all those little thoughts go through your head. Why do the Germans always win on penalties? Why did that man look at me so rudely in the elevator? What, you know, all that stuff. And that settles, as the Buddhists say about meditation. It's like a glass of cloudy water when you start, but if you just leave it, it settles. And after about 15 minutes, you get a little bit clearer, and then you can just start to play. But you play. Now, the thing about children's play is you can't say to a child you're playing wrongly. There's no such thing as a mistake when you're playing. So when you're being creative, there's no such thing as a mistake, because you get an idea and you have to follow it through to see if it is any use or not. But you don't know immediately it's a mistake. You just have to try everything and be very uncritical, because we're all good. Everybody, one of you watching me now has got a very good critical, logical, very verbal mind. You're all good at that. You wouldn't be, where you are if that were. You can do that bit, but you have to put that on hold, because when people are playing, you have to get away from pressures. Pressures are interruptions, time pressure. Sometimes those sort of feelings, oh, I can't do this is too difficult, I'm no good, I ought to kill myself, all that kind of stuff just puts pressure on. But if you can just relax and start to play, then you will start having ideas, new ideas. Now, I said new ideas. I didn't say they'd be good. Some will be good, no, some else are good, some will be terrible. But when the idea has become clearer, then you bring in your critical faculties and you think to yourself, well, is this idea going to fly? Is it good? And then you might say, well, I like that bit of it, but that bit's wrong, and I'm not very keen on that. So then you can go back into the creative mode again. You can say, well, we'll keep the bit that's good and get rid of that. Well, let's build on that. And then you start playing again with what you've got that you already like. And you can do this. You could go backwards and forwards between the creative and the critical. But the main thing is here, don't bring your critical faculties in too quickly, because when you first get an idea, it's rather fragile. It isn't clear, because anything coming up from the unconscious, it's in terms of hunches and feelings, and not neat little messages that have been typed out for you, sent up from the unconscious. You suddenly get a feeling, or something pops in your mind. You think, why did I think of that? What's that right? And you play. But until the idea that's sort of coming to you slowly, until that becomes reasonably well formed, don't go into the critical phase, because new ideas are like babies. They're easily strangled. So you can go into this iteration of creative and then critical and then back to creative again as long as you like. I mean, I used it in a slightly different way when I was writing Fish Called Wanda, which took 13 drafts. Towards the end, I would do a draft that was all to do with getting the plot right. And then I'd do another draft, which was all to do with getting the motivations, getting the feelings right. And then sometimes that would mean that I'd have to go back to the plot again, the sort of more left brain or hemisphere stuff, and sort that out, and then come back to the right hemisphere stuff and start making sure that the feelings were okay and fitted. So that's the basic thing, is you've got to play. And the reason you've got to play is that you have to get out of the rut. And there's an interesting neurological explanation for all this. A guy called Donald Hebbs, a Canadian neurologist, I think it was he who said if neurons fire together, they wire together. And this is an explanation of habit, because if you do something a number of times, the connection becomes an almost an automatic one, almost like a wire. And once it's become like a wire, it's very hard to get out of that stereotypical way of thinking that you've now formed. It's a bit like somebody hires a little house for the summer, and when they get in the house, there's a little shed at the back, but the grass is very high. So they push their way through the grass and they go to the shed. And then, of course, when they've had a look around the shed and want to go back to the house, they come back down the path again. And from then on, naturally, if they want to go to the shed, they go down the path and back again and there and there. But if they went a different way, if they came off the path and started wandering through the longer, they might find something quite interesting. So play is the way that you get off the path or off the wire that's been formed by the firing into a new area. So I think that's pretty much all I've got to say. So Laura, why don't you come back in and see if there's any questions?
Hi, John. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, there's a lot of questions coming in.
Good.
So hopefully we'll be able to get through some. I'm no Matthew d'Ancona, but I will go through these questions and...
Do we know if he's still alive?
I don't know.
Well, he could be dead, you know. I mean, anything could have happened to him in the last hour, poor chap, because he's got two lovely boys. So. No, well, I want everyone to say a prayer for Matthew and to say, dear God, please make sure Matthew is still alive.
I'm sure he is. I'm sure he's all fine.
Too sure, I mean, anything.
Right, so Amanda says, what piece of work of your own do you think displays the most creative flair?
Oh dear, well, I'm not sure, because the 40 Towers were farces, so they were constructed within the, I suppose I should say, trope of the farce. You know, farces have certain rules, and I knew those, and I was sticking to Monty. I think probably some of the Monty Python sketches, when we came up with things that you really couldn't explain how we got there. But I can't think of anything in particular. You see, I've never operated from a very deep emotional level. I mean, comedy isn't about that. Comedy is about clarity for a start, and a lot of creativity is really being at ease with confusion, because you don't know what's going on in your head a lot of the time. And Einstein said that when he was thinking creatively, he even sometimes used muscular tensions and muscular feelings are part of his thinking, and that he could at no point express in words what was going on in his mind until he'd really figured it out. Then he could tell you in words what he was on about. So I'm rather wondering, I think it's because I can't say to you, I think there's anything. I mean, one of the most creative things I ever did was, my mother was a very depressed woman, and when she was telling me after my dad died, giving me all the reasons one day why she didn't want to go on living, it suddenly occurred to me that she had a very black sense of humor. And I said to her, well, Mum, you know, if you're still feeling this way next week, I know a little man in Fulham, I could give him a call if you want, only if you want me to, and he could come down to Western Supermarket to kill you. And she kind of, there was a silence, and then she cackled with laughter. And I think that was brilliant, because I realized that I could get her out of this very depressed mood by making a very black joke. And I think that was a risk that I took, and I was very pleased when it worked. I think that was a very creative moment.
How old were you around that time then?
Well, she was probably 90, so I was 50.
Oh, right, okay.
She lived to 101, almost impossible to get rid of her.
So the bloke in Fulham didn't get called upon then?
No, he died before she did.
Right, so Alwyn, I think that's how you say the name. Do you keep all your ideas and hope to return to them, or do you discard ones that you don't deem worthy?
Well, I don't make a conscious decision like that. Sometimes an idea that I've had 10 years ago will recur, but I never consciously throw it away. I mean, you use certain ideas and the others you may or may not keep in your mind, but not a conscious process of, well, I must discard that one now. It doesn't work like that.
What, are you creative? What ways are you creative? Do you do art? Is it just in your acting or your comedy that you're creative?
Well, I think I'm reasonably creative in my writing and also just in the process of living. I mean, any businessman has got problems and you can come up with more or less creative solutions to them. So I think in a funny kind of way, people having practical problems in business or to some extent, obviously in their private lives, they can use this stuff just as much as creative artists can. I've asked John Dupre, who wrote the music for Wonder and wrote the music for Spamalot. He read the first or second draft of this and seemed to think it was pretty much how he worked when he was composing music. So I was very pleased about that. But I've given it to some artists because I want them to tell me, do you have a process like this or is your process different? I'm not saying that this works for everyone. I know it works for a lot of people because I've done this speech for 30 years, and a lot of people have told me that it's helped them. And it doesn't mean it was helpful to everyone. And one of the things that people find very difficult is a lot of people are very frightened of making mistakes, even if nobody knows about the mistakes. They don't want to. And particularly if you're in a creative group, people are terrified to begin with of saying something and everyone's going to go, "Ooh, what an idiot." You know, and that's very, very deleterious to the creativity of the group until people start trusting each other. But the whole business of creativity in a group is very, very different from anything that I put in this book because it's almost a separate subject. I mean, what I would say is that diversity is the key thing to creativity in a book. But the diversity needs to be managed because you must want a diversity of ideas, not diversity of other things. You know, like political ideas.
Yeah, of course. God, I don't think I've ever seen this many questions in any one of the events that I've done, actually.
Have you had What's the Old Fool Talking About yet?
I haven't scrolled down to that one yet. Right, so will there be another volume in your autobiography?
Yes, I should be settling some more scores. There's no point in doing that while I can still move around because I mean I'm 80 now and I don't move as well as I do. I just had a bone spur cut out of my foot. I mean a real one, you know, not one of Donald's. And that took a long time to heal. So I'm not as active as I was. My energy's not as good. So why write an autobiography when I have other things to do that would take up more energy? For example, I'm doing a treatment at the moment of a film which I thought of as a light comedy, about cannibalism. And it's called Yummy. And I'm having some of the most disgraceful ideas I've ever had in my life. And there's something about that kind of turns me on a bit. I kind of feel a little bit naughty.
Oh, I can't wait for that. Brilliant. So you're not going to write about the operation removing your spur of bone? That would
I think that would be outstandingly boring, you know.
Put it together with
I think Michael Palin would have written about that at great length.
Right, so we have a lot of questions about advice about wannabe comedy script writers. So I don't know if you have any advice on when, you know,
Well, I think the greatest thing to do, whether you're an actor or a writer, is to take something that you really love, a scene, if you're an actor, or a piece of writing, a scene again, if you're a writer, and to watch it again and again and again until you're bored by it. Because when you are bored by it, you can then, for the first time, see exactly how it's done. You can see what the technique is. You cannot see the technique if you're still amused by it or touched by it emotionally. And this was my idea. And then I discovered that my old friend Bill Goldman, who got a couple of writing Oscars for Butch Cassidy and All the President's Men, he used to say exactly the same to young writers. Just look at something that you really love by someone you admire and watch it again and again. I used to take old Peter Cook records, this is how long ago it was, and I used to take a sketch like how to train ravens to swim underwater. And I would play it to myself, and then I'd stop it and try and write it down from memory. And of course, I'd make mistakes and get it wrong. And I'd go back, listen to it again and say, oh yeah, that has to go before that. And you can't do that till you've done that. So I'd rearrange it again, and then I'd play it again, and then, oh God, I forgot that. And if by looking in real detail at something that's really good, I'm not sure you're teaching yourself to be creative, but you're teaching yourself technical skills that you can then use. Like, you know, painters in the old days, they used to have to copy old masters' paintings. Well, that obviously didn't make them, if they were copying, it didn't make them creative, but it gave them the technique that they could use as they became more creative.
So we have a secondary school teacher here, Virginia. She says, so the ability to play is the key to creativity. How do we reteach creativity to kids? Working in a secondary school, I've noticed that kids have a lack of imagination and creativity.
I think it's terribly difficult because it depends on the class size. I mean, I actually taught for a couple of years in a small prep school in Weston-super-Mare, and what I felt was if the class was about 15, I could have a personal relationship with each of the pupils. But if it went over 25, the main thing was keeping some kind of order so that something could be achieved. And if you're trying to keep order, then this is almost the opposite of a creative atmosphere. So I think I think teachers, I very much hope teachers will get this book, and we'll see how much of it, in the very difficult conditions in which they're working most of the time, how much of this can actually be imparted. But you can still sit down and say to kids, if you really want to do something of a creative kind, which might suit you, you might love it, then just get quiet.
Yeah, yeah. Do you personally know anybody 70 plus folks who discovered their creative writing ability? So anybody over 70, do you know anybody who's discovered their creative?
Well, I don't think I know anyone who discovered it after that time, but I think there's no reason at all that they shouldn't. And last Sunday, I had a wonderful experience. I was in Yorkshire making a movie, and I went over to Scarborough to meet Sir Alan Ayckbourn, who's written about half of the great English comedies that I've ever seen. And he's 81 and still writing and getting joy. He writes something and then he gets the actors in and he has a room in his own house where they come and research. So he's rehearse, I'm sorry, and they play together. You see, that's what it is. Somebody asked me today, why do you and Alison Steadman get on so well? And the answer is because we just know how to play together. We try this, we try that, we alter a line, we just play. And there isn't a feeling of, oh God, I've got to get this right. Because the moment people start thinking, I've got to get this right, they cease to be creative, because that kind of pressure, God, I can't make a mistake, pushes you back into the stereotypical thinking. You know, you're walking back down that little path in the high grass again, because that feels safe. It isn't taking you anywhere new.
So how do you record your creativity? Do you make notes?
Well, I have a very complicated system, actually. I have a thing here called a pencil.
Yeah.
Well, it's plastic, it's not expensive. And if you do that, you see a lead comes out at the end, and then you can write on a piece of what we call paper. And I find that infinitely superior to trying to type it and having to pull back or scroll back or whatever you say. And what I really love to do, because the most interesting thing about writing is creating a story or a plot. What I love to do is to buy a big sketch pad, you know, one of those really big ones, and then write on it in pencil. And what I love about it is that if I make a mistake, I just turn the pencil upside down. On the other end is a thing called an eraser, and you just get rid of what you've just written. And that enables you to think, oh yes, I put that idea over there, instead of having to scroll backwards and forwards on the screen. So I think that this, and also I like the sense of organic connectedness when I'm actually writing with a pencil on a piece of paper.
And then do you keep those pieces of paper?
Well, yes, I do. And I give them to serfs to type out for me, because otherwise you can't send them to people.
Right, so Stephanie says she thinks in pictures but struggles with words. Any ideas or techniques that might help?
Well, it's great. I mean, she needs to put them into words eventually, otherwise nobody knows what she's talking about, unless she can simply draw the pictures. But if you think in pictures, that's fine. And you see, if you are connecting with the unconscious, which is where the creativity comes from, as I said before, you're not getting neatly typed out little messages in words from the unconscious. You're getting pictures or images, and you're getting feelings, and you're getting hunches, and thoughts are popping in your mind. So it's not an orderly verbal process. But I think at some point she needs to learn a little bit better how to put the words down. The answer is keep everything as simple as you possibly can.
Sam Trudgill, I'm a stand-up comedian, currently trying anyway. Would you say music helps or disrupts the creative flow?
Well, I think it can help. But I find that I want music that does not distract me or take my attention. So I want to play.
What's your music?
Well, I mean, if you play something you're really familiar with, it can be there. And sometimes if it's got the right kind of mood, it can lift your mood a little bit if you're writing some humor. You see, I love the music from High Society is what I always play. I love all those songs. And I know them so well, I'm not distracted by them. So they play in the background, but the emotional tone of the whole musical is around, and that lifts me. So I think it's great. I mean, if you're writing a tragedy, you know, play some Bartok or something. It just helps with the mood. But I think it has to be music that's familiar so that you're not really listening to it. Otherwise, it would be a distraction.
So you don't like a quiet household? You like something in the background?
I normally work in the quiet, but I have used music. There's no reason. And some people, I don't listen to a lot of music for some strange reason. I'm almost embarrassed to say it, but I mean, people who do like music can use this to help their creativity.
How did you and the gentlemen of Monty Python's Flying Circus sort through creative differences?
Mainly, well, the first criterion was, is it funny? And this wasn't an argument when we'd written stuff together, and we got together usually at Terry Jones's house, and then we would read the stuff out. And if people laughed, it was in the show. And if they didn't laugh, it wasn't. And if a bit of it was funny, we'd find somewhere using the funny bit. But so far as putting the stuff together and integrating the stuff, we never wrote sketches with 4 or 5 people in the room, because I learned in my first couple of years is if you have 4 people, whatever is suggested, one of the 4 won't like it. So you can never make any progress with 4 people writing. 3 is possible, but 2 is probably the best. And when you're working with someone else, of course, you will get to some places that you would never have got to on your own, because he or she will say something and that'll spark off a new train of thought, which probably you would never have had if you were alone. Does that answer it, do you think? Or was it
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Thank you. Hannah, how much does the "I hate everything I do and think I'm awful" feeling dominate your process? And does it lessen as you get older? Please tell me if it does.
Yes, it does, because
Or
what
please
happened,
tell me it does.
what? Yes,
It,
the feelings are very frequently there. One of the sweetest things I ever read was that Claude Monet, or what the Americans would call Claude Monet, but the painter, Claude Monet, the French person, when he went off to paint early in the morning, even when he was 70, 80 years of age, his hand would shake because he wasn't sure that he could actually do it today. And that's the point with the unconscious. You can never guarantee that it's going to throw stuff up. It might not. What helps is, what helped Chapman and me when we used to think, oh, we're hopeless, we're no good. We began to realize that we had good days and bad days, and there was an average of about 15 to 17 minutes a week that we regularly did. Even if we had a terrible Monday, we'd have a good Tuesday afternoon and a Wednesday morning, and then it wouldn't be too good, and then it would be good again on Friday. And we could average this. And what you realize when you average it, that when it's not coming, it will again, if you stay with it and you're patient. And if you regard, Gregory Bateson once said, you can't really have a new idea until you've got rid of an old one. And if you think of that, when you're in an arid period and nothing's coming, if you just think, well, we just have to sit here, we're making space for a new idea, this is all part of the process. But if you start thinking that the process is only good if you're actually producing stuff, and that the process is appalling and embarrassing and disgusting if you're not producing stuff, then that's not going to help you, because it's going to depress you and probably make the arid periods longer. You just have to say, sometimes it comes, sometimes it doesn't, and if it's not coming at the moment, let's play. I think Galton and Simpson used to play board games. If they got arid, they just play board games for a couple of hours to get in a different frame of mind. So it's all part of the process. The fertile periods and the infertile periods are all part of the same process. Just be patient.
and
And you
what's
learn
your
that as you get older. As you get older, you learn to trust it more.
Have you had periods of block, if you like, in the
Oh,
past?
yes. Well, particularly earlier
The
on.
longest you've had?
Well, you don't know, particularly when you start, you're very unsure whether something's funny. And now I think I know pretty much whether it's funny. What I don't know is whether it's fairly funny or very funny or a little bit funny. And sometimes in front of audiences, I'm very surprised that something I thought was hilarious gets a polite laugh, and something I thought was, commonplace gets a huge laugh. Does that answer?
Yes.
I think I left that
No,
open.
I'm just relating to things that maybe I've said before that I thought were really funny, and I think it happens to everybody.
Oh, it does. Yeah, I had a line when I was talking about my mother, and I said she suffered from omniphobia. That is to say, she was frightened of everything. You name it, she had a morbid dread of it. And then I would say, well, I don't think it's quite fair, because I never saw her frightened by a loaf of bread. You see, now I always thought that was very funny. Never got a laugh. You just
I'm
don't
sure
know.
that most of us are laughing right now.
Well, maybe, but I mean, a lot of people won't be, because
Yeah.
a sense of humor is very subjective. You can never make everybody laugh.
No. David asks, do you have any tips for tricking your brain into working on the problems you want it to work on whilst you're asleep?
The answer is no. But I think if you put the work in before you go to sleep, that's the way of doing it. I mean, when I used to write sketches and not be able to find the punchline, I was talking about right at the beginning, and then in the morning, the answer would come quickly. It didn't come if I didn't cudgel my brains the previous night. Or to give a much wider example, people aren't going to make some advance in physics if they don't put in an incredible amount of work on understanding the present state of physics first. You see what I mean? You've got to prime the pump. You've got to do the work first. In most cases, I think sometimes something can just come to you out of the blue, and some of the Nobel Prize winners feel almost guilty that they got a new Nobel Prize because the idea just came to them and they feel it was like a freebie, a gift from somewhere, and they don't really deserve the prize.
John in Cardiff says, if you've been working away at a writing idea for a couple of years and still don't achieve a breakthrough, do you discard it, or how do you find the motivation to persevere?
I think you probably discard it and come back to it. You see, there's no reason you've got to stick at something. When Connie and I were writing 40 Towers, if we got stuck on an episode, we sometimes put it to one side and start a new episode. And if you come back to work after you put it to one side, you have a very, very clear ability to see how good it is if you've got away from it for a time. You see what I mean?
Yeah,
like Monty Python, when we used to go and see the first cut of a film, we wouldn't all go, only two of us would go so that the others were fresh for the next screening. So if you get away from something for a time, it's much easier to see what's right and what's wrong with it.
Thank you. Jay asks, at what point of the Python era do you feel you were at your creative peak? When you were relatively new nobodies with no pressure, or when you became household names and had a certain level of expectation?
We didn't really become household names. It was something that went on growing after we'd finished. I mean, if you listen to the reaction to the parrot sketch or the silly walks the first time it was actually broadcast, it's very unremarkable, the reaction. You wouldn't listen to it and think, what a phenomenal response. It's just, and then sometimes for some reason, things just start growing. And I think that started to happen more when we toured England and started to did a show at Drury Lane when we were doing the stage. That's when people for the very first time started telling us that they'd actually learned some of the dialogue. I mean, I never heard of anybody learning the dialogue of a show. Has anybody ever learned Dad's Army or Steptoe? I don't know. It's all, I don't pretend to understand it.
People do, but have you ever seen a film so many times that you know a lot of the words? No, you probably don't have time.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I love it, the fact that people do it, but it's never something I've done myself. I mean, I see films occasionally again, but The Great Dictator, the Charlie Chaplin film about Hitler, for example, I've seen that 3 times. But no, I tend usually to be moving on rather than going back and watching old favorites.
And did you play to warm up for creating the Monty Python sketches, or how did you?
Oh, well, what writers do that they never write about it is that they never sit straight at the desk and start writing. They sharpen pencils, make coffee and rearrange their pinboard and sort out their socks. And I always used to think, why can I never start writing? Why do I always find these little things to do to pass the time for a bit? Sharpening pencils in particular, tidying your desk, and suddenly thinking, I'm going to put those things in the right position. That's actually what that's doing, is just getting ready to move from your everyday, slightly agitated, what have I got to do mind, into a gentler, quieter, more meditative way of thinking. And just by doing things like making coffee or something, it's a bit different from making a lot of phone calls. So it's helping you get into a more creative mood, because somebody once said to me, if we're sad, we have sad thoughts. If we are angry, we have angry thoughts. If we're jealous, we have, you see what I mean? So what we want to do is to get into a creative frame of mind, which is where we get, if we've been able to sit quietly for a bit without interruptions and without worrying about other things we should be doing.
So how do you deal with rejection? James asks. Rejection in your creative career?
Well, I think the main thing is to try and understand it, but it can be very puzzling. I mean, I went to see Netflix just under a year ago, and I gave them 6 ideas for things I could do for them, of which I thought 3 were really quite original, and they didn't even call my agent back. And that's disappointing, because if they don't like them, it would be quite interesting to know why, but they never seem to want to give you real feedback. They always say, oh, we liked it very much, but it's not for us. You see what I mean? And I've got a 67-minute video of a show I did in Athens last September at the Acropolis, which I think is full of good material, and I'm absolutely unable to sell it to anyone, and I have no idea why. So the answer is try and get feedback, because you don't have to agree with the feedback. I mean, the feedback may be nonsense, but there's certain types of feedback which are very important. And when I show a movie to people, I always ask them 4 things. The first thing is I say, what did you understand the story? And then the second thing I say is, in other words, was it clear? Did you understand? Then the next question is, did you believe it? Did you think, I don't believe that would have happened, or I don't believe she would have done that? You see what I mean? That's, and then you say, where were you bored? And then you say, where were you upset and offended? And if you ask those 4 questions, you'll get all the feedback that you really need. But the trouble is, once you've asked people that, they start telling you how to fix it, and they don't have a clue, you know.
So you wish you never asked them in the first place?
Oh, no, because you want the feedback. I mean, when somebody's bored, when somebody says, I was very bored, then you, wow, okay, they were bored here. Why were they bored here? Was it here that it got boring, or was it the scene before, but they didn't really notice the boredom? And there are all sort of technical questions like that.
Well, if
but
people say the opposite thing, I was bored and I wasn't.
Well, then you have to make a judgment. It's
Yeah.
like anything else in life. You can't have a completely logical rules that never ever give you any space for judgment. Well, you can if you work for security in an airport, you know.
But... So here we go. Let's go to the next one. Do you think your creative mindset has changed throughout your career?
I think I've got freer as a result of the therapy. A lot of people think therapy has an effect of stifling creativity. It's the opposite. I think as you go into therapy, you don't find there are so many things that you back off from because you're a bit uncomfortable about them. And I think that means that you can be employ your creative abilities in a wider field of subject matter.
Dan is asking, do you have a favorite joke? Put you on the spot rather, but
yeah, I have a rather soft spot for, well, there's 2 favorite jokes. One is, how can you tell if someone is vegan? And the answer is, because they tell you again and again and again.
Are you
the
vegan?
Other one is like how this is a completely victimless joke, and there aren't many of those, which is, how do you make God laugh? And the answer is, you tell him your plans. I think after the last few months, everyone will identify with that joke.
You're not vegan, are you?
Or are you? No, I'm one of the people who think if God hadn't meant us to eat animals, he wouldn't have made them of meat. It's perfectly simple.
Do you have a favorite comedian at the moment?
Eddie Izzard. I like Steve Coogan. I've always liked Steve Martin, although I like the earlier films that he wrote himself. Those are the 3 that leap to mind.
Good choices. Right, where are we? Is it the same procedure to write a script and a political article?
No, I wouldn't have thought so.
No.
I wouldn't have thought so at all. No, I would have thought they're very different. Pity we don't have Matthew Danconi here, because we could have talked that. Incidentally, is he dead? Has anybody?
Nobody's reported that.
No accidents yet. Oh. Well, if anybody's watching who is connected with the
police, Google it.
Yes. No, oh, Google it now. Yes.
Another Daniel. I keep picking on Daniels. Is creativity different in science and art?
I don't think so. I don't think the principles are very different. I mean, the only thing in science is that you've got to know an awful lot before you can start pushing the boundaries into new areas. Do you see what I mean? I think no, I think they're very similar. And the key book, if anyone wants to read a wonderful book on creativity, it's called Hair Brain Tortoise Mind, and it's written by Guy Claxton, like the printer with an L in the middle, Claxton, Guy Claxton. And that deals in particular with scientists. And it surprises people because a lot of people think that what I've been saying is a bit woolly. But once you get down to it, you find it's exactly how scientists work. And the man who has more patents than anyone else in history, Edison, inventor of the light bulb and practically everything else, this is how he used to have his ideas. He used to sit in a comfortable armchair, and in his hand he would have a few small ball bearings, and he would have a metal plate or bowl on the floor, and he would sit there with his hand above the plate, and he would just relax and try and get into that lovely hinterland between being awake and being asleep, because he thought that was where he got his best ideas. And if he actually fell asleep, his hand would relax and the ball bearings would drop onto the metal plate and make a noise, and that would wake him up. But he'd pick the ball bearings up again and sit there, because he thought if he was in that area of dreaminess, because somehow that's where the unconscious is closer to the conscious, where the sort of barrier between the two becomes more permeable. And he thought that that was when he had his best ideas. So I told you, Einstein always said he couldn't describe in words his process of thought until he'd finally clarified exactly what it was he'd been thinking about. So this is all very much the way that scientists work.
Do you meditate at all?
I used to meditate, and I should start again, but I always get up in the morning and go straight to the computer in the hope that some disaster has happened to Donald Trump. And I can't really make my first cup of coffee until I found that out. And then I don't have time to meditate.
One day. Right. Well, I'm just wary of the time, but
I was thinking of my favorite line in Life of Brian, which is where Brian has been captured and is brought before Pontius Pilate, and after there's been a bit of an argument between various of the Romans, he just says, "Can I go now?" I think that's a terribly funny line. I was just about to say it.
Is that what you want to say?
Well, I mean, I don't want to bore people, and I've been going an hour.
I know.
God knows what's happening at the cricket.
That's another thing to Google when you're finished. If we can keep you just a couple more minutes.
Yes, sure.
Right. Julia had a question about advice for creative women in comedy to convince peers and society that women are as funny as men. And you did.
Well, yes, you see, women have always been funny, but the first time I think that there were women who were as funny as the very best men was when Jennifer and Dawn got together. And I was terribly proud of them because they were the funniest people in England, you know? And the reason was they didn't give a tinker's cuss. They didn't care what they did. They just went out and did it. There was, up to that time, I think women had always held back a little bit because they didn't want to be too undignified or silly or something. Do you see what I mean? Whereas the best men, if you think of the Goon Show, they were not trying to show that they were very sensible, responsible adults. Do you see what I mean? Yeah. And once women started to go for it, they were absolutely as funny as the men. But I think the need not to make fools of themselves was holding them back until Jennifer and Dawn.
Yeah, they were my absolute favourites at school.
They're wonderfully funny.
They are. And looking back, they're still funny now. And I'm sure that if I showed my son their sketches that he would find them funny, so they're consistently funny.
The one about the furs is
My favorite is the one where I can't remember. It's somebody's boss comes to the house and she gets Jennifer gets very flappy and basically chucks everybody out because she can't handle the situation. Do you know
I
Orange?
don't remember that.
Yeah,
But they are hilarious. They are absolutely hilarious.
you very much are. Right. Here we go. Here we go. Do you think you've peaked in terms of your creativity, or
I don't know. I think I have to, since the divorce, I've had to spend a lot of time just earning money. And most of that means performing. So I go out and I do a stage show. I think I'm at my most creative when I'm able to write. But you have to have enough money before you can stop and just write for a time. And I used to accomplish that in the old days by doing commercials. You get a nice chunk of money and then you could just spend that looking, you know, giving yourself time to write. Now I've been acting a lot and I'm going back to writing. So I'm very much looking forward to doing the comedy about cannibalism. If I can get anyone to finance it.
Well, have your holiday first, but
Yeah.
I think we're going to have to wrap it up. And I just want to apologise that I am here instead of Matthew d'Ancona, and it's been an absolute honour talking to you.
It has. It meant when you are lying there on your deathbed, Laura, these moments will flash before your eyes, and you'll think it was all worthwhile in the end.
I know. And thank you. I'm sorry if I hope there's been over 130 questions in the Q&A function. So having to feel.
Well, if people really want to know the questions, ask me back on and we'll just deal with the questions. It's very pleasant to do. And if it's helpful to people, it's lovely.
Okay. Well, we'll all be Googling Matthew d'Ancona when we've finished. And
yes.
I wish you all the best with your cannibalism project.
Did I tell you the title?
No, please do.
The title is Yummy.
And remind us the title of your book, which I think...
The title of the book is John Cleese, Creativity. There were lots of little lemurs. Nobody asked me why are there lots
of no, okay. Do you want to just quickly explain the lemurs?
The lemurs, because they play. Anybody who's ever watched lemurs playing knows it's just, you can watch them for hours because they're just playing and they're not worried about making mistakes.
Well, thank you so much, John, and thank you to everybody who's joined us on this Sunday evening. An honour, as I say, and good luck with everything. And
thank you, darling.
And you can go and check the cricket scores now.
But we'll check about Matthew first. Okay. Should I check here, just make sure?
No, I'm sure.
Oh, shit.
Right, we'll leave that to everybody else to discover. I will say goodnight. Thank you once again, everybody, for joining. A copy of the video will be sent to your inbox in the next 24 hours or so. And have a great rest of the evening, everybody. And thank you again, John.
Bye. Bye, Laura. Thanks.
Good night.
Bye-bye.